Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, let's talk about sour grapes. The rest of the NBA is apparently complaining still about the Gobert trade. They're mad at the Jazz, they're mad at the Timberwolves. I'll tell you why that's ridiculous and why everybody else just needs to get over themselves. We'll also wrap up Summer League, what to look for moving forward. Also, the Josh Minott deal. He's been signed to a contract. We'll break that down. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. Big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, you can find this show anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's, of course, free and available on YouTube to watch. As you'll see, I'm another day in a different location, so we'll be back to the normal, I guess, not really that much more exciting, but the normal setup here on for Tuesday's show. But you can watch this on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, it does look a bit different around me. You can also listen anywhere you get your podcasts, Google, Apple, Spotify, Odyssey. You can find this show. And again, a big thank you for listening. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at my account, which is at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. There's actually a lot to talk about here mid-July, almost late July at this point. We're still daily Monday through Friday, and I've got a ton planned this week. Today, there's plenty to talk about. There's the sour grapes about Rudy Gobert, about that trade. I want to get to that first. I want to talk about the Josh Minott signing, the Timberwolves contract the contract the Wolves signed Minott to following Summer League, and then what that means about the current roster and cap situation. And then we'll also wrap up Summer League. The Wolves played their final Summer League game on Saturday, so a couple notes there. The rest of this week, plenty to get to. We'll talk about that at the end of the show, but let's start with the Gobert stuff. So, I mean, we're what 2.5 weeks now post this trade, and people are still talking about it. It's to date the biggest trade, obviously, in the NBA this offseason. The Kevin Durant shoe has not dropped. And clearly the Gobert trade has had an impact on that market. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But the issues that people have, there's two reports that are kind of key here. One is Brian Windhorst at ESPN had reported, he said on a podcast, and I'll paraphrase a little bit here. I'll paraphrase here what was said on the podcast, but Brian Windhorst said, from the Jazz perspective, people are upset with the Jazz. People are upset with Danny Ainge, of course, who's in charge now of the Utah Jazz front office. And he's saying, look, what he got for Gobert, everybody's complaining. Can you believe it? How could they possibly do that? And then Windhorst says this is directly from the pod that he was on. It was on his own Hoop Collective podcast at ESPN. He said, I mean, I've talked to 10 different people who have complained. I'm substituting the word he used to me about that trade. Not only did they get all that stuff, 4 picks, 3 unprotected, 1 lightly protected, they offloaded 140 million in salary. So now Danny Ainge has moved the game again. So he's saying people are upset with the Jazz because he doesn't say these words, but he insinuates, the Jazz ripped off the Wolves in this trade. Danny Ainge ripped off Tim Connolly in this trade. And then there's a report from our friend Matt Moore from the Action Network. He's, of course, Hardwood Proxycism on Twitter, and he is the co-host of the Locked On Nuggets podcast. And Matt reported in his article on the actionnetwork.com, he's, of course, one of the hosts of Locked On NBA as well. He says, I'll read this directly from his article. He says, there's some wondering in league circles about who exactly pushed hard enough for the Wolves to trade 4 picks and a swap for Rudy Gobert. Was it Tim Connolly looking to make his stamp immediately, or eventual new ownership in Mark Lowry looking to reshape the team in his and A-Rod's image? And then he goes on to quote a couple of executives that says basically, this is crazy, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of it, Matt says, this is an inherent issue, this being the market being damaged by a team, quote unquote, overpaying for a player. He says, this is an issue when you have 30 teams actively competing against each other while also being responsible for market stability. The Wolves' primary responsibility is not to the market, but to themselves. If it makes things harder for another team, that, in fact, is a feature, not a bug. As one executive said, quote, yeah, Minnesota screwed us if we look to move one of our key guys, but isn't that what they should want? End quote. These are fascinating perspectives because it's absolutely true. The Wolves completely turned the market on its head. They overturned the market, the trade market for a star player, because immediately this happened, what, a day after the Kevin Durant report that he was looking to get traded from Brooklyn, and Brooklyn was listening. And there, the Wolves had called Brooklyn, and all these other, everybody basically in the league had called Brooklyn. And then the Gobert trade happens, and everyone says, well, if Gobert gets 5 firsts and 3 starters, essentially 3 rotation guys, what's Durant going to get? 7 firsts, and what's he worth? Really, at that point, he's probably worth 8 or 9 firsts if you could possibly trade that many. And why should that bother the Wolves? The Wolves got what they wanted. The Wolves wanted another All-NBA player. They wanted the best defensive player, arguably, in the league. They wanted the best defensive big to pair with Karl-Anthony Towns. They wanted the synergistic fit between a player who can fill in where Towns has gaps in Gobert, and a player who has Towns to fill in for his gaps. Towns, covering where Rudy struggles. Yes, the Wolves overpaid, and I've talked about this on the show. In a vacuum, they paid too much for Gobert, but there's so many other layers here, right? If they really believe Gobert's the perfect fit, then why shouldn't you pay what you think you need to pay to get that completed? Who cares if it upsets the market? And as Matt points out in his article on the Action Network, it's a feature, not a bug. Who cares? It's an ancillary benefit, right? If Kevin Durant doesn't end up in Phoenix, if he doesn't end up in the Western Conference at all, maybe because the Timberwolves really messed up the trade market with their Rudy trade, Tim Connolly's going to smile about it. He's happy about that, right? I'm not at all suggesting he did this. I don't think it's a chess versus checkers. I don't think anyone seriously thinks that was part of this, was like, oh, let's overpay so Durant doesn't end up in the Western Conference. No, but it doesn't hurt if that's an ancillary benefit, right? I don't think Connolly's upset about that. If this then makes it harder for the Nets to trade Kevin Durant, keep him in Brooklyn, keep him unhappy, keep him out of the Western Conference playoff race, sure, that's great. So if that kind of upsets the trade market and causes teams to pause before they do stuff, that's not an issue. And who cares if the Wolves paid a little bit extra for a player they feel like fits perfectly? And then there's also the market layer. I think it would be remiss to ignore the fact that the Wolves aren't going to, remember, they were going to have cap space next summer. They weren't going to attract a true a max player, a 1A to Minnesota. You look at the list of guys who are going to be free agents next summer. They were going to have to overpay somebody, give somebody the max that didn't deserve it, which would be a bigger issue than what they ended up doing. A player who's worth the max currently, maybe Gobert won't be in 4 or 5 years, but he is currently. And yes, they had to give up picks. It's different than signing a free agent. But that's better than overpaying somebody on a max contract next summer in free agency that doesn't deserve it, or clinging onto that cap space. What we see too often happen with the Knicks, and well, the Knicks are probably the easiest example, but all these other teams that hoard this cap space and don't get the top flight free agents. So then they fill it with these other contracts, these 1, 2, 3-year deals, mostly 2 and 3-year deals that clog the cap space. And now you've compounded the issue. The Wolves instead said, okay, we'll give up a lot of assets in Beverly and Vanderbilt and Bolmaro and Beasley. We'll give up these guys plus 5 essentially first round picks and Kessler this year. So 6 if you include Kessler in the swap. But we also know we're getting a player who is worth what he's being paid now. We're getting a second top 20 player. The Wolves now have 2 top 20, or I'll give you top 25 players, plus Anthony Edwards, plus D'Angelo Russell, and now depth as they've continued to do work in free agency with Kyle Anderson, Austin Rivers, and Bryn Forbes, and the way that they filled out the roster. So clearly, it doesn't bother the Wolves that other teams are upset with them or upset with the Jazz or whatever that might be. This was an intelligent, or I guess the better way of saying it is it's a, as I said before, an ancillary benefit if other teams are ticked off about this. The Wolves don't care. They're not obligated to set the market for everybody else. They're obligated to look out for themselves and themselves only. I'm sure this is a combination of Connolly wanting to make a splash and Laurie and A-Rod wanting to make a splash and Glenn Taylor wanting to win now. All those things absolutely play into it. Remember, Glenn's only got probably 2 seasons left in charge as the majority owner. And we know that Laurie loves win shares. We know that Laurie loves advanced metrics. We know that Laurie sees that stuff and knows that Rudy has an impact in those areas. So there are so many different factors at play here, and this was kind of the perfect storm. And Danny Ainge, credit to him for capitalizing and saying, hey, look, we could run this thing back and still probably be a second-round playoff team, and you get lucky from there. You could win a title. I still think he could have done that, right? He could have taken a lottery ticket on another season of Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, but he said, look, we're not going to get more than this for Rudy. So, I mean, the Jazz are happy. The Wolves are happy. Obviously, we'll see how it plays out on the court, but the sour grapes are hilarious that the Wolves, first people were mad that the Wolves overpaid for Tim Connolly and that they offered whatever this equity thing, and it's not pure equity, but whatever this bonus structure is for Tim Connolly that the Kroenke family was so upset about in Denver. Who cares? They're trying to win. And then they overpay for Rudy Gobert. Who cares? They're trying to win. For so many years, the Timberwolves and other teams in the Twin Cities market have they've, I guess, underpaid, right? They haven't taken that leap. The Wolves have now taken multiple major leaps in the last several weeks, and the league doesn't like it. Who cares? The Wolves are accountable to themselves and to their fans, to their ownership group, and they got to do what they got to do to win. Who cares? I just think it's hilarious to watch the sour grapes pour in from around the league. So anyway, that's my take on it. All right, I want to talk about the Josh Minott contract signing here in a minute because he did sign over the weekend and is now under contract, which means the Wolves just have the one roster spot remaining. So I want to get to that here next. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball, which is now at the All-Star break, Home Run Derby Monday night, All-Star Game Tuesday. I'm sure all that's on BetOnline. You can also look ahead to NFL preseason, which is like 3 weeks away now. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Plus, BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. You can head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Which NFL stars move the betting line the most starting July 18th? That's today. Monday, July 18th, Locked On gives you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers at BetOnline. Available July 18th on Locked On NFL, wherever you listen to your podcast, plus on YouTube. All right, let's talk about Josh Minott. Timberwolves second-round pick, of course. We know Matteo Spagnuolo is going to play overseas, so that leaves obviously Wendell Moore as the first-round pick after Kessler was traded. Wendell Moore has the guaranteed rookie first-round rookie deal. So the question was, would Josh Minott sign a two-way deal? Would they give him a partially guaranteed deal? And they did go the route of giving him that 4-year, essentially a minimum deal, which is basically exactly what the Wolves did with Jaylen Nowell a couple of years ago, I guess 3 years ago, as a second-round pick, and with Naz Reid as an undrafted rookie that same year. Those guys are each in the final year of their 4-year deals. They're each going to make about $1.9 million this year. Josh Minott will make a little bit over $1 million over the course of the contract. I think it averages maybe 1.7 per year. By year 4, Minott will be making about $2.2 million. It's effectively the same deal with the cap rising. It's the same thing that the Wolves did with Naz Reid and Jaylen Nowell 3 years ago. And of course, both of those have turned out to be bargains. Year one, neither of those guys played very much, but as the years went on and those guys got more NBA experience and they were pressed into service with the Wolves, it became clear that both of them were legit NBA rotation players. And I don't know what Naz Reid's role is going to look like. We talked about that a little bit on Friday's show, but he's an NBA rotation player. Jaylen Nowell is going to be a key player off the bench for the Wolves this year, essentially assuming that quote unquote Malik Beasley role. I've talked before. He doesn't play like Beasley, but it's essentially that microwave scorer off the bench, 6-man type role. Jaylen Nowell is a big part of this team. Naz Reid is a big part of this team. Both of them are making under $2 million this year. Complete bargain signings and great moves by the Gerson Rosas front office 3 years ago. Josh Minott, same deal. It's going to end up being 4 years, and I think it's like 6.8 or 6.9 million over the course of the 4 years. Again, it'll be up to about 2.2 million that final season. But this is essentially a minimum contract. The Wolves still have the biannual exception to use. So I guess first let's talk about Minott and what that means for this year. And then we'll talk about the rest of the offseason and the roster and the cap situation. Well, it's basically the same as Naz and Jaylen Nowell from 3 years ago. Josh Minott's not a rotation guy from day one, just like Leandro Bolmaro wasn't last year. He ended up getting a chance due to injuries and COVID and situational. They gave him a start, I think, in Philadelphia or Washington or wherever that was, and they gave him a couple of games in the rotation and ended up not working out. Perhaps Minott will get an opportunity at some point this season. Hopefully there aren't injuries, but this is a really deep team. I talked about this the other day, 1 through 12. You have a starting lineup that's all basically 1 through 12. You're talking about guys who have all been a part of a rotation of a playoff team. I mean, you've got a bench with Jaylen Nowell and Austin Rivers and Bryn Forbes and Naz Reid, and all these guys aren't going to play. Taurean Prince, these guys, Kyle Anderson, they're not all going to be in the rotation. very likely on opening night, they're going to play 9 or 10 guys. And I'm guessing Austin Rivers and Bryn Forbes could be the two that are left out. Or it could be Jordan McLaughlin, depending on matchups. This is a really deep team. So don't expect Josh Minott to get minutes right away. But I talked about him in regards to Summer League about a week ago after that really strong showing, I guess a little over a week ago, or would have been a week ago. It would have been Monday's show last week, that Minott could play that Brandon Clark-esque role for the Wolves. The Wolves need what was the Jared Vanderbilt role last year to be filled. They need somebody to be that energetic front court player who can kind of do it all, the do stuff guy, right? The blocks, the steals, jumping passing lanes, getting out in transition, rim running, filling the dunker spot and getting offensive boards and stuff like that. That's what Josh Minott's going to do. He's not going to do it from day one. He won't be in the rotation from day one, but maybe it's a end of the season thing. Maybe it's a fill in here and there thing. Maybe it's a 23-24 thing, a next season thing. Looking ahead to next fall, perhaps he ends up in the rotation, but either way, he's going to be making less than $2 million each of the next 2 years and just over $2 million the 2 years after that. So if he can provide anything over the next 4 years, anything positive, remember, Noel and Naz Reid didn't do much as rookies, then he will be a steal of a draft pick and a steal of a signing for the Wolves. So don't expect him to be in the rotation immediately. Expect him to probably get some run at the Iowa Wolves of the G League. I think that's very possible here this year. Related to the current roster and cap situation, the Wolves now have one open roster spot after signing Austin Rivers. I guess it was late last Thursday. So we talked about that on Friday's show. And they signed, of course, Josh Minott now. So there's one open roster spot plus the two-way deals. Very likely Nate Knight ends up, they've issued the qualifying offer. Likely he ends up in one of those two-way deals. So we'll call it one more two-way deal and a roster spot. They have the biannual exception available to use. So they could go out and sign somebody else who's still in the market. Of course, DeMarcus Cousins gets talked about a ton as a possibility. I don't love it right now. It feels like it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Wolves go into the season with an open roster spot, see how things play out. Hopefully there's no injuries, but in the event that there are, perhaps it's a boogie, perhaps it's another move to fill that spot, to fill that roster spot with potentially the BAE, the biannual exception. Otherwise, it's a roster spot and it's a two-way deal. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple candidates for the two-way spot here in the last segment of the show. But the Wolves have maintained a little bit of flexibility, and considering they basically signed Bryn Forbes, Austin Rivers, and Josh Minott all at vet minimum. Well, not in Minett's case, but minimum deals for what they're available to be paid. Forbes, Rivers, and Minott. That's some pretty good filling out of the roster by Tim Connolly and his staff. And now, like I said a minute ago, 1 through 12 or 1 through 13, even you could argue this is a really, really deep team. Of course, you've got your starting lineup. You've got your big, really, it's kind of it's a big four now with Karl-Anthony Towns, D'Angelo Russell, Rudy Gobert, and Anthony Edwards. And then you add in, obviously, Jaden McDaniels and his upside. You've got your bench with Kyle Anderson and Taurean Prince and Naz Reid and Jalen Noel and Bryn Forbes and Austin Rivers. That doesn't even include your first-round pick, Wendell Moore Jr., and then now your second-round pick, Josh Minott. That's a 1 through 13 with the 13th guy being Wendell Moore Jr. There's some upside and there's some stability, some veteran leadership still with that group. It's really, really impressive roster building, I think, when it comes down to it. So we'll see what they do at the final roster spot. We'll see if they do use that biannual exception and how they use it. And if possibly they've done this a couple times recently, left a roster spot open going into the season for a just in case type of a situation. The only remaining free agent they have that is still out there is Jake Layman. I think it's pretty unlikely he's back. And then, of course, there's the pending situation with Nate Knight. I want to talk about the other two-way spot here in a minute as we close out the Summer League conversation. So we're going to do that here next. All right, the Timberwolves closed out Las Vegas Summer League on Saturday. They finished with a 2-3 record after they beat the Charlotte Hornets by 3. It was actually arguably the most exciting Summer League game. There were a couple of duds in there, certainly. But, I mean, it finished pretty fittingly. Josh Minott blocking a Hornets shot attempt just before the buzzer that was a potential game-tying shot. Kevon Harris fittingly was the leading scorer for the Wolves in this game, and played really well, was the only Wolves player with over 20 points. And we'll talk more about him in just a second, but I think it was kind of a microcosm of the 5 games as a whole, where Kevon Harris scored a lot. The Timberwolves as a whole were relatively sloppy. Josh Minott had his moments. He shot 5 of 8. He had 5 boards, couple steals, couple blocks, had the game saving, if you will, block, or game preserving, I guess, block. Wendell Moore did his thing where he had a fairly well-rounded game, but missed too many threes and just was a little bit sloppier than you'd like him to be, but showed the ability to do all the different things that the Wolves expected him to do when they drafted him. So we'll talk about him in a second too. The only kind of outlier type performance was the Matt Lewis performance. He, of course, was on the Iowa Wolves of the G League last year. Didn't play in 1 or 2 of these Summer League games and saw his minutes increase as Summer League went on. He scored 19 points off the bench for the Wolves on Saturday. Shot 7 of 14, hit a couple of threes. He likely will be back with the Iowa Wolves. I wouldn't expect him on an Exhibit 10 or wouldn't expect him in training camp necessarily, but the Wolves obviously like him on some level to have him on the Iowa Wolves all last year and then invite him back to Summer League this year. So good game for Matt Lewis. Let's talk about Kevon Harris, though. Well, actually, no. Let's talk about Wendell Moore first. So Moore had an up and down Summer League. He had a couple of really strong games, but for the most part, he was kind of middle of the road, where the counting stats look good. The points, the rebounds, and assists were pretty good. The shooting percentages weren't great, and there were kind of a lot of turnovers. There were some Olay moments defensively, but he competed. And the way I've described him all along is kind of a two-way role player, if that makes sense. He's somebody who should be fairly well-rounded as an overall player. He should be able to defend and distribute and shoot threes and do all these things at an adequate NBA level. And he demonstrated all of that in Summer League. A little bit sloppy, a little bit raw, but a player that improved consistently throughout his time at Duke. Remember, he shot under 30% over his first 2 years at Duke from outside the arc, was over 40% as a senior. A player who, to a person who talks about Wendell Moore, and apparently Coach K is, as he often is for Duke players, one of his biggest champions, a player who knew what he needed to do to get better, took instruction, and continued to improve. And we saw a lot of I don't know, basically that in Summer League. And it was a 5-game microcosm, but we saw the suggestion that he's going to continue to improve at the NBA level. The fact that right now he can kind of plug and play and do a few of these things with certainly some roughness around the edges. I thought it was overall a good Summer League for Wendell Moore. I don't think there was anything alarming. I think everyone knows he's got to continue to work on a shot and prove that his last year at Duke wasn't a fluke in terms of his outside shooting. He's got to be a little more consistent on those corner threes. The turnovers, he's not going to be asked to initiate offense as much at the NBA level, certainly not right away, as I said a minute ago, likely the 13th guy on the roster. He was asked to get outside his comfort zone and do a little bit more of that in Vegas. It's what the Wolves did with Jalen Noel and Jaden McDaniels last summer. And both of those guys took pretty impressive mini jumps this season with the big Timberwolves in the NBA. So hopefully Wendell Moore is challenged to do that at the Iowa Wolves this year. Hopefully he gets some time in the G League and when called upon at the NBA level, hopefully there's some of that from Wendell Moore as well. But I thought it was a fine Summer League for him. Remember, he's doesn't have the expectations on him that some of these lottery picks do, or other first round picks might. He's going to be expected to be a depth piece and learn on the fly. Tim Connolly said this right after the draft, that these guys aren't going to be expected to step into a playoff team and immediately contribute. They're going to be expected to, learn, be ready if called upon, and then in a year or two, be a part of the rotation. And that's the hope with Wendell Moore. Is maybe 12 months from now, we're talking about him ramping up to being a rotation piece. Perhaps, Jalen Noel's a free agent after this year. There's going to be some roster spots opening up. Taurean Prince has a non-guaranteed deal next offseason, or next year, I should say. The 23-24 season is not guaranteed. There will be opportunities if Wendell Moore shows in practice and in limited action at the NBA level and perhaps at the G League that he's ready for it. He'll get the opportunity next year as well. Josh Minott, another, like I said, 12 and 5, a couple steals, couple blocks, no turnovers. He didn't have any offensive rebounds, but he had that game-preserving block, was active, did a little bit of everything. That's going to be his role. I think he's got a clearer path to minutes, honestly, from day one. Now, neither him or Wendell Moore will be in the rotation from day one, but I think he's got a clearer path to minutes because he can play the 4 and be effective in that position and in that energy, that Jared Vanderbilt-esque role for the Wolves if they need it early this season, if they need a jolt, if they need somebody to provide, do stuff around the fringes to provide energy minutes. Josh Minott could be the guy, and he was that in Summer League. It was very impressive. I should mention Mariel Shayok. Mariel Shayok was one of my favorites in Summer League. He had 7 points, 10 assists, 4 steals in this game. Misses only 2 3-point attempts, but he's a kind of a limited upside 3-and-D type guy. Of course, he has the NBA experience with Philadelphia. I thought he had an outside shot at getting an invite to training camp, perhaps an Exhibit 10 type guy to play in the G League, or maybe even a 2-way deal. I think that's probably less likely because of the limited upside, but maybe I'd keep an eye on him as a possibility. Kevon Harris is the player that rightfully so. Everybody's talking about 23 points on 11 shots in this game, made all 4 of his 3-point attempts. He did turn it over 7 times and only had 1 assist. Also committed 5 personal fouls. Both turnovers and fouls were a little bit of an issue for Harris during Summer League, but he could score the ball, making the open threes. We know he has range on the three-pointer. We saw lots of 25, 26, 28-foot jumpers from him over the course of Summer League. We also saw him score in traffic. He had a couple of tough buckets in this game in traffic, a nice dunk, a couple of nice kind of up and under reverses. We saw obviously the and one from the first game of Summer League. That was a monster highlight, the poster and one that he had. So Kevon Harris is really intriguing and a little bit of upside there, but I think both in the case of Harris and Shayok, they could be plug and play type guys. And perhaps the Wolves are looking for that with their two-way spots. Remember, this is a team that expects to be a second round playoff team. They want to be a top 3, 4, 5 seed in the Western Conference. So if you fill your two ways with Nate Knight and say a Shayok or a Kevon Harris, those are more experienced older players who should be able to plug and play in due to in the case of injuries or COVID or issues like that. Instead of finding these undrafted rookies, like the Wolves have done in the past with Jordan McLaughlin, or I guess Naz Reid's a better example, or last year McKinley Wright, guys who weren't necessarily ready to play, but they had they had some upside. And so you think maybe we could develop them, potentially convert them into NBA contracts down the road. Now, because the Wolves are in the place that they're in currently, do they just look for guys that have perhaps lower ceilings, but higher floors, and again, plug and play ability from day one? So Shayok and Harris could both fit that bill. Don't be surprised if one of those guys fills that second two-way alongside Nate Knight. Overall in Summer League, though, 2 and 3 for the Wolves. Solid performance from Wendell Moore. Very good, encouraging performance from Josh Minott. Kevon Harris, kind of a revelation. Mariel Shayok, some good moments. Matteo Spaniolo, some good feel moments. It didn't talk a lot about him because he was kind of in that 10 to 12, 14-minute range throughout Summer League. He had some nice moments, some nice passes, but clearly is a bit raw. Shot selection needs some work. We knew that. But Spaniolo will go back over and play in Europe again this year. So another, obviously, player to keep an eye on. But I think the two names to watch for as potential two-way signees, or we may see them in training camp, would be Kevon Harris, who I believe did sign an Exhibit 10 deal, so he should be in training camp regardless. And then Mariel Shayok would be another one that I like. Terrell Brown Jr. did not play in this game, but he'd be another one from a point guard perspective to potentially keep an eye on here moving forward. So that does it for Vegas. Another Summer League in the books. One of the, I guess, generally more anticlimactic ones for the Wolves, with only the one first-round pick to root for. And, of course, no Walker Kessler, who everybody was excited to see in a Wolves uniform. But, yeah, I mean, that's it for Summer League. And hopefully we get a little bit of clarity here on those two-way spots here in the very near future. All right, rest of the week, we got shows every day this week through Friday. I want to talk about Seth Partnow on The Athletic. He did his tiers. I want to give my thoughts on where he ranked different Wolves players throughout his tiers. And then several other things to cover as the week goes on, what this roster is going to look like, et cetera, as we gear up for kind of the meat of the offseason. And by that, I mean, meat isn't the right word. I guess the desert portion of the offseason, where there's just generally less, but there's still a lot to talk about. This is an exciting Wolves team. And I think the tiers conversation is a really fun one. So we'll get to that here a little bit later this week. Thanks again for listening to Locked On Wolves. Of course, a reminder, you can find this show anywhere. That includes, of course, Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, and YouTube. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken, with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Network, and the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. A reminder that you can make your second listen the Locked On NBA show. You can get up to date on the latest news and rumors in the NBA in just 30 minutes every day with the Locked On NBA show. Locked On NBA, your daily NBA update in just 30 minutes. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.